In the limestone darkness of Qumran Cave, four archaeologists recovered fragile Aramaic fragments of the work now called First Enoch. Among them is 4Q201, part of a manuscript tradition far older than the Ethiopic copies through which the complete book survives. These fragments are real. Mars is real. But the surviving text does not say Mars was once inhabited, nor does it identify the red planet as the prison of the Watchers. That is the first answer. The mystery begins because First Enoch describes a cosmos filled with rebellious heavenly beings, wandering lights, places of confinement, fire, darkness, and stars punished for violating an appointed order. In chapters 18 and 21, Enoch is shown terrifying regions where stars are bound. Elsewhere, the Book of the Luminaries maps the motions of the sun, moon, and stars with intense concern for celestial order. Modern readers sometimes connect these images with planets, including Mars. But a connection is not an identification. No surviving Enoch manuscript names Mars in these passages. No archaeological fragment describes creatures living there. No ancient line says a civilization died on its surface. What remains is harder. Why do the text's stars sometimes behave less like distant points of light and more like conscious beings assigned to cosmic stations? If Mars is not directly named, what exactly are these imprisoned stars supposed to be? And why did Enoch's authors imagine the heavens as a place where something could rebel, be judged, and fall? What remains is not a Martian report, but an ancient Jewish cosmology preserved through a complicated chain of manuscripts. The Qumran evidence matters because it pushes portions of the Enochic tradition back centuries before the medieval Ethiopic manuscripts that preserve the complete work. Among the Aramaic witnesses from Cave 4 are 4Q201, 4, Q202, 4, Q20, 4, 4, Q2054, Q2064, Q207, and 4Q212. The Israel Antiquities Authority identifies 4Q201 as an Aramaic parchment manuscript from Qumran Cave. 4. Written in a square script and assigned to the Hasmonean period. Its survival places these ideas firmly inside the religious world of Second Temple Judaism, not inside a modern theory about Mars. Those fragments do not preserve one seamless book in the form modern readers encounter. First Enoch is a collection of compositions transmitted together, including the Book of the Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dreams, and the Epistle of Enoch. Separate Aramaic copies of astronomical material also survive at Qumran as 4Q208 through 4Q211. That distinction is crucial because claims about planets must be tested against the specific section in which celestial language appears, not against the title Book of Enoch as though every chapter describes the same vision. The complete text survives principally in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, while portions also survive in Greek and other ancient witnesses. Comparison among these traditions allows scholars to reconstruct older readings, but reconstruction has limits. A damaged fragment cannot be made to say what its surviving letters do not support. So when Enoch describes stars that move, transgress, or are imprisoned, the first question is not whether one of them is Mars. The first question is what the ancient author meant by a star at all, and whether the language is astronomical, angelic, symbolic, or deliberately all three. That distinction determines everything that follows. Because once the vision itself is read closely, the stars begin to behave less like planets and more like condemned beings. In 1 Enoch 18, Enoch is carried beyond familiar geography into a region described as the edge of heaven and earth. He sees a deep abyss, columns of heavenly fire, and 7 stars resembling great burning mountains. When he asks what they are, the explanation is moral, not astronomical. These stars have transgressed a divine command. They failed to appear at their appointed times, and they are bound until the completion of their punishment. Chapter 21 sharpens the image. Enoch reaches another chaotic place with neither a visible heaven above nor firmly founded earth below. 7 stars are bound there, burning like mountains. Uriel identifies them as stars of heaven that violated the commandment of the Lord. The same vision then leads Enoch to a still more terrible prison, which Uriel explicitly describes as a place of confinement for angels. That sequence matters. The text moves between celestial language and personal beings without explaining the boundary in modern scientific terms. In the worldview of this apocalypse, a star can participate in a moral order. It can obey. It can transgress. It can be judged. Mars does none of those things in the surviving text. A modern reader can notice that Mars was one of the visible wandering lights known in antiquity, and the word planet itself ultimately comes from a Greek term associated with wandering. But that comparison does not identify any of Enoch's 7 imprisoned stars with Mars. The number is wrong for such a simple equation. The text gives no planetary name, and the beings are interpreted inside the vision through the language of rebellion and punishment. Yet this creates a different possibility, one rooted in ancient cosmology rather than extraterrestrial history. If some heavenly bodies could be imagined as living or angelic powers, then the question is not whether Enoch visited Mars. The question is whether an ancient audience could look at the moving lights of the night sky and understand some of them as signs of intelligent beings under divine rule. And if so, what exactly did wandering mean to them? The answer becomes clear when another section of 1st Enoch uses the same imagery in a different way. In the Book of Dreams, chapters 85 through 90, human history is retold through animals and celestial figures. Enoch sees Adam and his descendants represented as cattle. Then, in chapter 86, a star falls from heaven. Other stars descend after it, and the vision turns violent. They mingle with the cattle, and monstrous offspring appear. The imagery continues into the judgment scenes that follow. This is not a description of astronomy in the modern sense. Scholars commonly understand the descending stars here as symbolic representations of the Watchers, the heavenly beings whose rebellion is narrated more directly in 1st Enoch 6 through 16. The animal figures represent human beings and peoples. The stars represent beings from the heavenly realm. That is a major clue. Within 1st Enoch itself, star language can clearly function as a symbol for an intelligent celestial being. A star can descend because the figure behind the symbol descends. It can rebel because the being it represents rebels. It can be restrained because the story is about judgment, not orbital mechanics. This makes the Mars theory both more interesting and more difficult. More interesting, because the text really does imagine the heavens as inhabited by personal powers. More difficult, because the evidence points away from identifying those powers with physical planets. Mars is never named. Its red appearance is never described. No Martian landscape appears. No inhabitants of a neighboring world are recorded. What once lived there, according to the surviving Enochic material, therefore, cannot responsibly be called a Martian civilization. At most, the text gives us an ancient cosmological world in which heavenly regions are populated by angels, some obedient and some rebellious, and in which stars can symbolize those beings. But the vision adds one unsettling detail. The rebellious beings do not remain safely in heaven. They cross a boundary, descend into the human world, and produce consequences on earth. So if Mars is not their prison, where does Enoch actually place the place of punishment? The hidden detail is not a planet name. It is a phrase about timing. In the older English translation by R. H. Charles, 1st Enoch 18 says, "The condemned stars transgressed at the beginning of their rising because they did not appear at their appointed times." The wording can sound surprisingly astronomical. A light in the sky appears when it should not, fails to appear when expected, and is punished for violating an imposed order. That is precisely the kind of language that can tempt a modern reader to think of a wandering planet. But the temptation outruns the text. The same passage calls the region a prison for the stars and the host of heaven. In chapter 21, Uriel again identifies the imprisoned stars as beings that transgress the Lord's command. The language of scheduled celestial movement therefore sits inside a theological vision of obedience and rebellion. It does not provide coordinates, orbital periods, planetary names, or a physical description of Mars. This small distinction has a large consequence. In Enochic cosmology, regular motion is not merely mechanical. The heavens operate according to decrees, the astronomical book. Especially chapters 72 through 82 repeatedly presents the sun, moon, and heavenly order through gates, courses, seasons, and fixed reckonings. Celestial regularity becomes part of cosmic law. So an errant star can mean more than an object moving strangely. Within the symbolism of the work, disorder in heaven can represent disobedience. That leaves the Mars claim resting on an analogy, not an identification. Mars is visibly different from the fixed stars and was known in antiquity as a wandering heavenly light. But first Enoch never tells us that this particular wanderer was one of the prisoners. And that raises the sharper question: if the prison is not Mars, could Enoch's strange landscape preserve any memory of a real place at all? Modern planetary science gives that question a sharp answer. Resemblance is not location. Mars contains landscapes that can sound Enochic when described in isolation. It has immense canyons, extinct volcanoes, impact basins, dust-filled plains, and a surface stained red by oxidized iron. Billions of years ago, it was also wetter and probably warmer than today. NASA missions have identified ancient river channels, lake environments, deltas, and minerals formed in the presence of water. None of this connects Mars to first Enoch. It simply shows why modern readers can be tempted to place an ancient vision onto a dramatic planetary landscape. Then the evidence becomes more provocative, but also more fragile. In 2025, NASA reported that Perseverance had identified what researchers classified as a potential biosignature in a Martian rock from the Bright Angel Formation. The mineral patterns could be consistent with processes involving microbial life, but NASA emphasized that non-biological explanations remain possible. In 2026, Curiosity researchers reported the most diverse collection of organic molecules yet found in a Martian rock sample. Organic molecules are chemically important, but they are not themselves proof of organisms. They can form through geological as well as biological processes. So what once lived on Mars, science still cannot say that anything did. Ancient Mars appears to have possessed environments that could have been habitable for microbial life, and current missions are searching for evidence that such life actually existed. No confirmed fossil, organism, technological artifact, city, or vanished civilization has been discovered there. That distinction matters for Enoch. If Mars once supported microbes, it would be a planetary science discovery. It would not identify those microbes with watchers, fallen stars, giants, or imprisoned angels. If a Martian canyon resembles an abyss described in an apocalypse, the resemblance remains an analogy. Geography requires coordinates, names, or independent evidence, and first Enoch supplies none of those for Mars. Yet the text survived because generations of readers believed its heavenly geography meant something. When later Jewish and Christian interpreters confronted its rebellious angels and cosmic prisons, they did not agree on how literally that world should be understood. The next conflict was not between Enoch and astronomy. It was between traditions deciding what kind of book Enoch was. That disagreement became visible long before anyone imagined Mars as a possible home for life. The Epistle of Jude, verses 14 and 15, contains language closely corresponding to 1 Enoch 1:9 and attributes the prophecy to Enoch, Shem, the seventh from Adam. That does not mean the entire Enochic collection was universally regarded as Christian scripture. It does show that Enochic tradition could carry authority for an early Christian writer. Some early Christian authors went further. Tertullian, writing around the beginning of the 3rd century, defended Enoch and appealed directly to Jude's testimony, even while acknowledging that others did not receive the book. Reception did not remain uniform. Across much of later Christianity, First Enoch did not become part of the biblical canon. Its complete text eventually disappeared from manuscript traditions familiar to Western European scholars. This was not one simple, documented decision shared by every Christian community. Different traditions developed different collections of authoritative books over long periods, while Enoch survived unevenly in quotation, translation, and memory. Then Ethiopia changed the history of the text. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo tradition preserved First Enoch and Ge'ez as scripture, allowing the complete work to survive when only fragments and excerpts remained elsewhere. Centuries later, European scholarship gained access to Ethiopic manuscripts, and the discoveries at Qumran transformed the discussion again. Aramaic fragments from Cave 4 demonstrated that substantial portions of the work belonged to Jewish literature of the Second Temple period. That discovery strengthened the antiquity of the text. It did not validate every interpretation of it, and it certainly did not turn its celestial prisons into a map of Mars. The historical conflict is therefore more subtle than a story of a forbidden planetary secret. Ancient Jews preserved Enochic compositions. Early Christians could quote and interpret them. Ethiopian Christianity retained the complete book. Other Christian traditions did not include it in their canons. Modern scholars then recovered much earlier witnesses. But preservation creates its own problem. If the surviving manuscripts preserve a genuine pre-Christian cosmology, how much of that cosmology can still be reconstructed with confidence from damaged fragments and later translations? That uncertainty is not theoretical. It is visible in the manuscripts themselves. The Aramaic Enoch material from Qumran survives in fragments, not as a complete ancient copy. The manuscripts represented by 4 Q201 through 4. Q212 preserve portions of several Enochic compositions, but large stretches are missing. Modern editions therefore compare broken Aramaic witnesses with Greek remains and the much fuller Ge'ez tradition. That process can recover remarkable amounts of ancient wording, but it cannot restore every lost line with certainty. The astronomical book exposes the problem especially clearly. Aramaic manuscripts 4Q 208 through 4, Q211 preserve material related to the celestial calculations now found in 1 Enoch 72 through 82. Scholars have noted that the Qumran evidence sometimes reflects a fuller or different form of the astronomical tradition than the surviving Ethiopic text. The ancient work was transmitted, copied, abbreviated, and translated across languages and centuries. That means the absence of the word Mars carries two different implications. First, no surviving passage identifies Mars as a prison, a fallen star, or a habitation of the Watchers. That is the evidence we actually possess. Second, because the manuscripts are incomplete, historians cannot claim to possess every sentence that ever belonged to every form of the Enochic tradition. A missing fragment is genuinely missing, but absence does not become permission to insert a preferred theory into the gap. This is where the present mystery becomes disciplined rather than sensational. We know enough to reconstruct an ancient universe governed by celestial order, populated by heavenly beings, and punctuated by places of punishment. We do not possess an ancient Enochic map assigning those places to modern planets. And one surviving absence is especially important. The Qumran Enoch manuscripts have not yielded the later parables of Enoch, chapters 37 through 71. So how much can silence in a fragmentary archive actually tell us? Now, an important distinction is necessary. The physical evidence is the manuscript material itself. In Cave 4 at Qumran, copies such as 4Q201 survive on parchment in Aramaic and belong to the Second Temple period. They prove that Enochic traditions about heavenly rebellion, cosmic order, and judgment circulated in ancient Judaism. They do not prove that the beings described physically existed. The textual evidence goes further within the world of the text. First Enoch describes stars that transgress, heavenly beings that descend, giants born from forbidden unions, and places where rebellious powers await judgment. Those statements belong to an ancient apocalypse. They are evidence for what its authors and transmitters imagined or believed. They are not astronomical observations of Mars. Interpretation begins when we ask what those images represent. Some passages allow stars to symbolize heavenly beings. The language of appointed celestial motion also shows that cosmic regularity could be understood as obedience to divine law. But neither point identifies one imprisoned star with the fourth planet from the Sun. Speculation begins when Mars is inserted into that silence. Modern science sharpens the distinction. Mars preserves evidence of ancient environments that could have supported life. and NASA has reported potential biosignatures and complex organic chemistry, but no extraterrestrial life has been confirmed. Organic molecules are not watchers. A possible microbial signature is not evidence of angels, giants, or destroyed civilization. If the imprisoned stars in Enoch represent rebellious heavenly beings, and if their movement through the heavens reflects an ancient attempt to describe cosmic order in personal terms, then the larger question becomes whether the Mars theory is looking for the wrong kind of world. Perhaps Enoch was never pointing toward a particular planet. Perhaps its heavenly geography made an invisible moral universe imaginable through the visible sky. In that reading, Mars matters not because the book secretly names it, but because a wandering red light reveals how differently ancient observers could understand the heavens. The strongest evidence therefore leads away from a lost Martian civilization and toward something historically defensible, an ancient cosmos in which celestial movement, spiritual agency, and divine judgment occupied the same conceptual space. One question survives. If Enoch's prisons were not planets, what did the people who preserved these texts believe they actually were? Back in Qumran Cave 4, the fragments remain silent about Mars. 4. Q201 and the other Aramaic witnesses do not preserve a hidden planetary name waiting to be decoded. They preserve something more historically important, evidence that ancient Jewish communities copied and transmitted visions in which the heavens were ordered, populated, and morally charged. The stars could be more than lights. They could become symbols of beings, rebellion, judgment, and cosmic law. That is what the physical evidence still allows us to say. The parchment fragments exist. Their script can be studied. Their surviving words can be compared with Greek and Gaia's traditions. The gaps can be measured. But none of those gaps has yielded Mars, a vanished Martian race, or proof that the Watchers once lived on another planet. Mars remains a world of its own, investigated by spacecraft and geology. Enoch remains an ancient apocalypse, investigated through manuscripts, languages, and history. The mystery survives because both confront us with distance. One is distant in space, the other is distant in time. And in the darkness between those distances, one final question remains when the writers of Enoch looked upward and spoke of imprisoned stars. What kind of reality did they believe they were describing?